Alright, so in this tutorial we're going to have a look at functions. So a function is basically a block of reusable code, okay, that performs a single action. Now at the moment all the programs that you've been writing so far, you've been writing them line by line. Python will execute each bit of code that you've been writing. Now if you wanted to reuse a bit of code, so let's say for example you had a bit of code that found the area of a circle, and you wanted to reuse that code somewhere else later on in your program, more than likely what you'd have to do at the moment is copy and paste that code, and you paste it at the relevant point in your program where you want to use it. Now, the issue with that is that, first of all, it's not very efficient because you're having to rewrite your code again, and second of all, it's going to make your code longer and messier. So what functions enable us to do is to neaten up our code and shorten it down, so that we can have a bit of code that we can call up and reuse time and time again, however many times we want. Now there are already a load of built-in functions in Python, and a really simple example is print. So when we want to use print, we've got print, which is the function name, and then we've got open brackets, and inside the brackets we put in whatever we want to print. Now that's a built-in one that already exists, but what we're going to have a look at is creating a user-defined function, a function that you created yourself. So we're going to have a look at how you structure a function, how you write it out, what the correct syntax is. So you start off a function with def, so define. So def, and then you've got your function name. Now your function name is going to be whatever you want to call it. So you want to call that something sensible, appropriate to whatever the function is going to do. So after your function name you've got open bracket, and inside your brackets you've got your parameters. Your parameters are basically like your variables, your variable names. So you've got your variables in there, you've got a colon at the end of the line, and then underneath, indented, very important, it's got to be indented, is the code that you want to be executed for that function. So let's have a look at an actual example. Really simple example. I've got a function that I created which will add two numbers together. So I've started off with def, and then I've got my function name, which is add, and then I got open bracket, I got my two parameters, and I got my variable names, my two parameters, num1, comma, num2. Now you can have more than two, but you separate them with a comma. Okay. And I got my colon at the end, and indented, I've got my code to be executed, and I got return num1 plus num2. Okay, so functions can return values, so I've asked it to return the result of adding these two variables, my parameters, together. So if I was to run this function, and I had 5 as my first number and 5 as my second number, what I would expect it to return is 10, because it's going to add the two numbers together. Okay. So that's how you write a really simple function. So we're going to put that into Python now and see what happens. So I'll copy and paste it just to speed it up a little bit. Okay, right, let me just correct that because that's an incorrect indentation. It should be one indent across. Okay, let's run this. Okay, now when I've run it, absolutely nothing has happened. Okay, now the reason for that is because you have to, if you want to run your functions, you have to call them. Okay, now that's not something you've had to do before. At the moment, all the code you've been writing, you run your program and it executes it line by line in order. Okay, now your functions need to be called. So if I just go back to my PowerPoint. Okay, now to call a function, you need to use the function name, and then in brackets you've got parameters. Now the parameters, let me just go back to Python, show you. If I run it again, okay, so nothing's happened, so I'm going to call it by using the function name, add, open bracket. Now you can see the parameters have come up, the variables that I've got inside here. Now this is where I'm going to actually type in sort of my input, what numbers I want. So I'm going to type in 10 and 10. Now the actual numbers that I've typed in, they're called arguments. So up here when I'm defining my function, these are called parameters. When I actually put in the numbers, they're called arguments. Okay. So I'm going to close my brackets, hit enter, and it comes back with the answer. Okay, now because it's a reusable bit of code, instead of me having to, if I wanted to add another two numbers together, instead of me having to rewrite that code to use it again, I can do it again, and it comes out with the answer for different arguments that I've typed in. Okay, so that is a really simple example of creating a function that can be used over and over again. Now, functions, you can define lots and lots of functions, so I could have another function that was for subtracting. Okay, and I'll have num1, num2 again, and this time I'll return num1 minus num2. Okay, now if I'm to run this again, I can call it my function subtract. Sorry, it'll help if I spelt it correctly. And I'll do 10 take away 2, so you'd expect the answer to be 8. Oh, right, sorry, I spelled subtract wrong when I defined my function, so let me just correct it. So you've got to be careful. Okay, let's try again. Subtract. And I'm going to do 10 again, 2, and we've got 8. Now notice it doesn't actually matter what order these functions are in, they can be in any order. So up until now, like I said, you've been writing code and it's been executing it line by line in order, hasn't it? Well, with functions it doesn't matter what order they're in. Okay, you can, as long as you call it up with the correct name, you can call up any function you want within your code and use it. So just one more thing to finish off with. If you can actually call your function from within your code, so instead of running your code and then calling the function in the shell, what you can do instead, if you want to run them, is you can actually run it right within the code. So I'm going to run my add function. So I'm going to do print, because I want to print out the value that's returned. Add, and now it's asking me for the arguments, so I'll do 10 and 12. Close my brackets. Now if I run this now, it's actually going to run that add function straight away. 32. Okay, now I can still use the add function whenever I want. Okay, and I can use the subtract one whenever I want. But what that's done by here is actually, as soon as I've run the program, it's going to run that function straight away. Now if I wanted to run my subtract one from within the code, I'll do subtract. Now that will actually run the add one first and then the subtract, so that order does matter. Okay, so if you're going to do it that way, it does matter what order you call your functions in. It doesn't matter what order they're defined in, but it matters what order you call them in. Okay, so if I run that now, it does the two functions add, subtract. Hope you found that useful.